The new 13.15 patch of TFT brought so many changes, and now there are a ton of viable carries. What are the best ones to play? Well, here are my top 7 queens of the meta that are ruling ladder so you can climb LP while looking cute as hell. Let's start off with the latest queen to join the party, which is Samira. Samira is the new build on this patch where a lot of people are rerolling her, in particular with Cassiopeia, so you can get a lot of high tempo and then win streak into a fast 8 or a fast 9. So this is unusual for a 1-cost reroll because a lot of other 1-cost rerolls, you end up lose streaking a lot early so you can get maximum gold. A lot of times with something like Samira, because she's such high tempo with things like the early Cassiopeia Samira Swain start, which is the best start in the game at the moment, you're able to snowball that lead, reroll, and eventually you lose a little bit, but once you stabilize, you start streaking again, you get to that fast 8 and fast 9. Samira actually is really good with blue buff in particular because it scales with her flare ability. Flare is only 30 mana, so you're casting a lot, and there's a recent quality of life change in the patch where Samira now can't miss her target, which is huge so that she can get that armor reduction very consistently. Cassiopeia 3 is really nice, and this second blue buff on Cassio is also really good, but really impractical to get, so you're not really oftentimes trying to go for blue buff on Cassiopeia, but let's say it's like a crazy item opener portal and you just get extra items, you can go for the blue buff on Cassio and Samira. It's a very deadly combination. In terms of positioning, you generally want to have Samira and Cassio kind of close to each other so they can kind of focus down similar targets, but sometimes towards the late game you just want to try to keep them a little bit separate. Your front line always wants to be kind of generic. Remember, Sion wants to be usually like A2, A3, A4 so that Sion charges corners. You have Aatrox kind of close to things like the Darius, for example, and then have like Katarina Clay on the other side. These legendaries are just recommended because Ryze is Invoker and Heimer is just the best legendary in the game. So if you're able to get that, I recommend the usual stuff for Heimer, which is triple burn or double burn plus Goldenator. They did buff this recently, so it could be better. In terms of augments, total domination is just insane. You get all of the 3 early Noxians and you're able to get the stacks going really quickly with the executes. It's just straight up OP. I also want to give shout outs to things like Golden Ticket, which is particularly good for the early game rerolls, because if you get Samira 2 and Cassiopeia 2, you can actually continue to snowball that lead. So Golden Ticket's like really, really good for this comp. And then I also want to give a shout out to Stars Are Born as well, because if you can get a 2-star Samira and a 2-star Swain, you are in a very, very good spot. I don't have Swain on this board currently because he's the late game version, but in the end, Swain is totally a unit that you can play around here. And let's say instead of this Ryze, you can just play around Ahri. So the legend I would recommend if you want to play the strategy pretty consistently is something like Lee Sin for the rerolls or Caitlyn for the tempo. In terms of the build-up, we kind of described it already in the early phases of the game through augments, but you generally want the core trio of Samira, Swain, Cassio. A lot of options here at your disposal. You can go for Warwick to get additional frontline, Galio for the Invoker, Irelia because she's another challenger. You have a lot of different options here at level 4. You can also just continue to add in more Noxian units, especially if you're playing things like Total Domination. So just add Darius and put that Warwick in so you get the Challenger and that Juggernaut. And remember, you're going to be re-rolling a lot at level 5 in particular because you want to get things like Samira 3. So make sure that you're able to get those stacks early. At level 6, you then end up going for 6 Noxians a lot. So you can play Katarina and Kled. But let's say, you know, you're just not hitting them while you're re-rolling and you're collecting them on your bench. So instead of playing Katarina and Darius, you can just play like Warwick and find Echo. Let's say you're not necessarily playing like the Stars Are Born, you don't hit Swain 2, you can just play Katarina here and have like Warwick, Katarina, Darius, Echo and play off the Zon mod. You finally hit Samira 3, congratulations, you're the best. Now start pushing levels, get to that 6 Noxus as fast as you can. You eventually add in things like Kled and Swain and you keep the Warwick in because the Challenger and the Juggernaut's really nice synergy ties. And then at level 8, you can add in pretty much whatever you want here that makes sense here. Since you're still playing Cassio, you can play that Ryze that we talked about at the very beginning. There's also a variation of this that you could play, which is Shurima based since you're playing Cassio, and that ends up playing around Nasus and Azir for the strategist. This is a variation that is a little bit inconsistent. I've definitely hit this before and feel like it didn't do nearly as much, and I ended up feeling like I wasted like 24 gold in the Nasus 2 and the Azir 2 when I could have played a cheaper board and probably pushed to level 9. But if you're in a situation where, you know, let's say you're playing Golden Ticket, you're getting extra rerolls, you might as well just hold these extra units. Oh, you made Nasus 2 Azir 2 and you're still at above 50 gold, just play them. So Loga Song also has this version of his level 8 board, which is kind of interesting. You just go for a 3 Noxus setup and then you play like Tarek Shen instead. This variation is specifically because Sologa Song and people believe that without items on Darius and Katarina, it's not really worth it because you're just playing units that deal a lot of damage, but nothing else. And so this offers a lot of utility in frontline. So consider this variation if you feel like you're hitting these units and not necessarily like rolling and hitting Darius and Katarina. If you do end up playing Ornn and you get like Ornn anvils of any kind, the best item here, in my opinion, is Trickster Glass on Samira. So you get 2 Samiras, double shred. You could also go for things like Infinity Force, generically very good. In fact, Infinity Force is good on almost every Noxian units minus Swain, which means that you could actually take something like Freaky Friday, play on Samira, Cassiopeia, Samira dares 2. Eternal Winter Holder would go for Swain. Hull Crusher would also go on Swain. I would say that there's probably a world where you can kind of go into the traditional Noxus line. So you could play like Death Defiant on Darius or DFG on Katarina. And that's probably fine. In reality, you're oftentimes going to be starved a little bit on item resources because you can't itemize Samira, Cassio, Katarina, and Darius. Just be really mindful of that unless you're playing like an item-centric portal. And don't be afraid to just play straight up a 6 Noxus as well with this kind of thing. Let's say you do end up hitting items for Darius off of Portable Forge or Ornn item anvils. Just like go for the usual stuff. So in this case, Darius would want a Hand of Justice, and then Cat also wants Hodge. And if your items end up being something kind of like this, then you're still in a really good spot. Like this is honestly like a really powerful setup that can probably top 2, maybe even win games. Although maybe you probably want Scion instead. So you go here to Scion. You eventually drop Swain in this spot because he doesn't really tie into anything except for Ari or Strategist late game. And I recommend something like Heimerdinger and maybe this Rise. One Rise I want to give a shout out to is Noxus Rise. The Noxus Rise gives items to all of your champions, which is actually really good since you have a lot of base stats through the Noxus stacks. Just don't sleep on Noxus Rise. You can also play a bunch of the traditionally good ones as well. If you're ever curious about what are the best rises, just go to something like the units section of either Tactics Tools or Meta TFT and just look at the average placement of all the rises. So for example, currently on this patch, as of right now, Ionia Rise is the best statistically performing one behind Freljord. So you can try to go for those 2. Oh look, Noxus Rise is actually really high as well, but no one plays it because no one picks the Noxus portals, man. Which is a pretty good thing. I don't like the Noxus portals very much. If you're picking it in my game, don't send me a friend request because I ain't accepting. By the way, I'm giving a nod to the new Shifting Sands. This is a really good comp to play in that portal because the Shifting Sands now has gone from you get a free magnetic remover every game to now you have a free Pandora's Bench augment. So you can transform a bunch of your 1 cost into Cassiopeia or Samira and your 2 costs into things like Swain and Kled. So you can get all that momentum going early and get those 3 stars very fast. Kayle is the queen of attack speed. She ramps up so much that if you don't deal with her, she's going to kill everything eventually, and she continues to scale as you level up and the fights drag on. The thing with Kayle is that you want to focus on maximum economy first. So you want to lose streak as cleanly as you can. You don't want to take full losses every single time, like 3-0, 3-0, 4-0, 4-0, 5-0, 5-0. If you can kill units while maintaining a loss streak so you can have maximum economy, that'd be the best. This is because it's just way too hard to get a 5 streak or 5 win streak rather while playing Kayle as your opener. From there, you're going to focus on hyper rolling down to probably 10 gold or less at 3-1 because it's really important you hit Poppy 3, Maokai 3, and Kayle 3. And a lot of times you're going to try to pick something like an economy augment to rebound so you can get back rolling, or you take a really good combat augment so you can streak on stage 3. The most important item that you want to focus on for Kayle is Rage Blade. This Gunblade is like a secondary item, and then maybe you end up playing something like a Giant Slayer or even a Guard Breaker, which ends up being pretty good onto Kayle specifically right now. You want to make sure you put good tank items on Poppy, but ultimately Poppy wants a rating item, so you always want to put 2 items on her. Her best are usually Bramble and either Stone Plate, Redemption, Declaw. There's a bunch of different items that you can justify on Poppy from there. An item that I also really like on Poppy is Protector's Vow because she gets the instant steadfast hammer toss that knocks them up immediately. If you do end up getting something like a Protector's Vow instead of a defensive item here, make sure you position Poppy right in front of their most important frontline unit. And that goes into the positioning, so you're going to be moving Poppy around a lot, especially if you have Protector's Vow. But if you don't, just make sure that Jarvan is always on the correct side of their carry to try to get the maximum AoE. And Aatrox is always next to Gwen. Gwen is the most important unit to pick up between level 6 to 8, and you want her to be itemized as a secondary carry source, which is really huge because Gwen is really good currently in the metagame. Gwen's best items are usually like crit plus Titans, or you can go for, say, like Archangels, Gunblade, and Giant Slayer. Like, you just have to play whatever you can get because you don't get to pick your items really for Gwen. Usually instead of Heimerdinger, you're playing Teemo up until you hit Heimerdinger. Sometimes this is a board that you roll for at 8 because you can't get to 9 very easily. Fast 9 is usually enabled through augments or an economy portal. I think a lot of times people think that 9 is like the most important thing, but stabilizing on 8 can also be equally important, if not more, to make sure that you're not playing 1st or 8th. And that brings us to our augments. Bronze Ticket's really good, especially with the Lee Sin augment, so I would say the legend to play this with is Lee Sin. Don't forget that there's also some generically good augments that give amplified damage, so you can take things like Petricide Sackles, and this is particularly really good in metagame because there's a lot of Noxians playing things like Samira, so you have a way to counter the Samira players. Level Up is also great because that helps you get to that fast 9. If you're playing Level Up, don't roll that much on 8. Just try to get to 9 as fast as you can, but you're usually picking this at 4-2 because you're using that as a way to get back into the game and find a way to scale up and match late game boards. At level 9, you pretty much just play like whatever legendary that you can really afford. So you could just play a Scion, for example, just as generic frontline. Scion 2 is never bad. Also, a bunch of Rises are actually quite good for Kayle, especially things that give a bonus attack speed. That would be the Ionia one. I've seen some weird variations as well where people play like Lux and they get like a Demacian emblem somewhere. So they go like Demacian emblem on this Aatrox or Gwen. And then they have like +1 item on Poppy, +1 item on Gwen. That Demacia version is generally not recommended. Just go for something like Senna, for example. And this is a good way to outfit your board. You should be able to win lobbies with this. If you get a +1 Shadow Owls of any kind and you end up getting a board like this, I would highly recommend trying Shadow Isles Poppy. It's actually hilarious and awesome. And you won't really get the Demacian item on her anymore, but this Shadow Isles emblem is like having a Radiant item because she gets a bunch of shield and mana and she's just going to be knocking a bunch of people up. Build up is pretty straightforward in terms of the 1 cost. You just hold Poppy, Maokai, and Kayle and you literally sell everything else. Nothing else matters. You want to maximize your economy early. A lot of times you're in a situation where you feel like your opponent is playing like a pretty strong board but a couple of weak units. You can replace Kayle and just play like a good couple of units, like a 1-star Samira, maybe a 1-star Warwick, and maybe you'll end up killing like a unit or 2. Just make sure you don't win the fight, but you can try to preserve HP while keeping things like your Kayle on the bench. And in reality, this also goes with other ideas. So like, let's say you have like a Rage Blade, but you slam it on Samira. Just be careful. Sometimes this can win fights. So don't slam things unless you know that you're going to lose for sure. And just try to aim for like 1 or 2 units that you're going to be able to kill per round. From here to the beginning of stage 3, you're going to be at level 4. You roll it down and try to 3-star everything. You want 3-star Kayle, 4-star Poppy, 3-star Maokai. And then eventually when you level up, you find either a Teemo or if you really need to, you can go for Tristana. If you are contested, it is entirely possible that you have 3-star Kayle, 3-star Poppy, and like 2 Maokais. There's a situation where you could theoretically also roll for Tristana, and that would be like your other 3-star, because remember, you need 3-3-stars in order for your Poppy to be upgraded to 4-star. But that's such a rare scenario. If you're contested Kayle, just play something else. Just figure out, like, play Samira, play Cho Bidem, just play something else. Just don't try to contest Kayle. That's going to be super hard for you to work with unless you have no other choice, because let's say you have like too many Kales or too many Poppies to ignore. At level 6, if you're starting to push levels, just add in any kind of Demacia. A lot of times people play Gallios to have a little bit of front line, but I think another unit you can think about is Sona. Sona gives an attack speed buff with her Crescendo, so it actually ends up helping Kayle a lot. And then at level 7, you start to add more Slayers. The ideal Slayer will be Gwen, but a lot of times you can't find Gwen, so you end up just playing something like a Zed instead. At level 8, hopefully you found the Gwen by now. And then if you're stuck on 8, you end up rolling a lot. Because you have Teemo, you're going to eventually replace Sona with Jarvan for Strategist. And eventually at level 8, you add in probably Zed, but until you find, things like Heimerdinger and other better units, this is probably what you're going to roll with. Ideally, you hit Aatrox. If you can get to 6 Slayer, it is worth it, by the way. And the data says that the best Slayer holder is actually Poppy, but that makes it hard to believe. A lot of times you're probably going to put on something like Teemo, and then Teemo comes out for a Heimerdinger, and then you just put the Slayer emblem on Heimerdinger. I'm not going to do Ornn items because you really shouldn't be playing this if you opened up Ornn. But if you decide to go against the advice of this video Galio and you want to play Ornn anyways, the item I would recommend is Zhonya's on Kayle. I would not recommend things like Sniper's Focus or DFG or anything else like that though. The other you could consider doing is Eternal Winter on Poppy or a Trickster's Glass on Poppy. The other thing that I'd want to shout out is actually shimmer items. I believe that you could actually play this with all that shimmers if you specifically get Gambler's Blade. Gambler's Blade is actually so good with Rage Blade because this Kayle is going to attack so much and give you so much gold so you can guarantee hit all the 3 stars. So if you open up Gambler's Blade ever and you have any reasonable start to get to Kayle with like a Rage Blade component, try to see if you can force this and you might be surprised by the results. The one portal I want to give a shout out to is the new Shifting Sands. The new Shifting Sands is so good for Kayle reroll as well because you have so many of the 1 costs that's going to be transformed every single turn. And you hit Kayle 3, Poppy 3, Maokai 3 super quickly. So just like Samira, you get that Pandora's Bench effect. It's really good. So if you are on that portal, give it a try. Karma is the queen of 3 cost AP right now. Invokers are very good and consistent and even have additional top end thanks to all of the Rise buffs this patch. Rise is like the biggest reason why this composition is better because so much of your top end is much more reliable if you hit that really powerful Rise that can carry and hold other items as well. In terms of what you really think about with the priority for this composition is you actually want to play this comp from ahead. A lot of times people try to play Invoker while like lose streaking. If you like lose 5 in stage 2 and then you're bleeding in stage 3 and then you roll down at 6 and you don't hit, you pretty much just go 8th. So try not to play this from a very bad spot. If you do have a AP setup, I recommend going for something else instead. I would also say that Shred is really important, but people used to prioritize a lot of Spark when in reality, the composition is kind of long form fights. So you can actually play Static Shiv just as well because it gives you the opportunity to have 3 frontline items onto the Shen. I put items on Taric here because these are often items that you can slam onto Shen as well, but sometimes you don't get the ability to put all the items on Shen. BIS Shen is something like Bramble, Titans, and a Dragon Claw or Redemption. Anything that has to do with healing so that Targon gives you additional healing bonuses. A lot of times people think about this comp as being super important for AP, but the only AP item you truly need is Gunblade because you're trying to sustain your front line. Invokers is a stall composition. If you guys remember Seraphine Graves from set 7 or if you remember Seraphine Enchanters from set 6, those are really powerful stall compositions that focus on shielding a lot. This composition is similar. I think a lot of people think about it as like another AP burst, but in reality you draw out the fight and you win over time because your opponent's not able to kill you. After you get Shred and Gunblade, a lot of times you focus on making sure you have a good balance of items on Shen and Karma. The most common win condition that you do is you roll for Karma 3 at level 7. So that way you can get a reliable carry and Karma can actually do a lot of damage both to the front and back line. But in reality, sometimes you're just so far away from Karma. Let's say you have Karma 2 and you have an Ari and everything else is upgraded. You might as well move up to 8 and try to find things like that Rise, get that 3 Ionia in because you don't usually get to do all that at 7. The only time you get to do that at 7 is if you have a +1 Invoker of some kind. Other augments that I really like besides the very obvious Loving Invocation, which gives you AP scaling similar to Heart from set 8, is Early Education, which is another AP source. One of the biggest mistakes I see people do with Invokers is just build more mana. They put like blue buff on Karma because they think, oh, blue buff plus the Invoker, she's just gonna machine gun rapid fire. But in reality, she'd just be tickling the opponent. She doesn't have any AP to deal damage with. She's just casting a lot of nothing that deals what, like 270 damage if she has no AP. And that's why things like Early Education and Invocation, anything that gives you AP like Magic Wand can be really good. The last augment I want to give a shout out to is Winds of War, or if you're a Twitch chatter, Winds of Woke. You basically decide to stack Galio instead with items, but make sure that the most important item that you put on him is Warmog because Winds of War scales Galio based off his HP. So make sure you get that high HP count, and that also works with other things like maybe Transfusion or Cybernetic Bulk, things that get that Galio to be really tanky. And in this case, you focus on rolling at 6 for Galio instead of trying to go for a 7 and hit for Karma and Rise and Ari. Positioning wise, you have actually a couple of options, but not that varied. For the most part, you always want to try to space out your backline so that way Shrouds and Jarvans and AoE just can't get to you. A lot of times you want to have that Taric sandwich because he shields adjacent allies, and you have Lysandra next to him as well, especially if Taric has the Redemption. But let's say Shen holds these items instead and he has a Spark, you can put him in the middle as well. Build up is largely dependent on someone like Cassiope Cassiopeia, and then you're trying to build around the early Noxus, so you get Swain and Samira. This is the strongest 3 core unit that you can have right now in the game. Then you have Galio as well. So Cassiopeia, Samira, Swain, Galio, and then you have Cassiopeia hold all the AP items like Gunblade and whatnot. Swain can hold things defensively like Bramble and Spark. And then you pretty much just add whatever makes sense. So in this case, let's say you hit an early Taric, you get a Sorcerer +1. You can also continue to add even more front lines. So let's say you hit this Kassadin at level 6. A lot of players like to roll pretty aggressively on 6 because there's so many cheap units that you want to pick up. If you're losing a lot and you need to roll at 6, then instead you go for like, you roll down and you hit Soraka and you try to go for a 4 Invoker setup with Karma. Remember, you can't really hit 6 Invoker on 6 unless you hit Shen or a +1. If you do have a +1, go ahead and go for that 6 Invokers. And then at level 7, it's pretty straightforward. Just putting Shen over this Swain and then find any 6 Invoker. In this case, it's Lysandra. If you do find a +1 Invoker, a lot of times people play Sejuani and then put like the Invoker spat onto a Taric, so that way he's casting, not keeping your front line alive. In this case, you probably drop this Cassio and you run a board like this. The nice thing about this setup too is that you don't really need something like a Spark immediately, although again, Invokers is a stall composition, so chances are you're going to need that shred even if you're running a Freljord. This is just additional frontline. At level 8, that's when you get that Arian if you can possibly find it, and then eventually you hit that Rise. Special shout out to Senna as well. Senna's ability is Redeemer, so whenever an ally gets a shield, Senna grants them 8% attack speed for the rest of the combat. That's pretty good because you just get a lot of shielding in this comp. Another option you can play at the top end is Heimerdinger as usual because he's just a broken unit. You can just give him a triple burn in this spot and just watch him melt things because you just stall for him infinitely. Also, because it's a frontline based composition, if you really need, just play Scion. I have a sneaking suspicion that on certain portals, double Rise is actually really good. So give it a try if you have an opportunity to play it. My favorite currently might be Shurima Rise, just because I get to farm so many treasure chests and you stall fights for so long that Shurima Rise gets to give you a ton of gold, almost like you're playing Urgot from Monsters Attack Set 8, where you farm a bunch of chests. If you're playing Ornn items, I recommend the usual package. Like Shen is really good with things like Eternal Winter and Anima Visage. Randuin's is actually a very good item in this composition. Don't try to full greed and like, you know, put Taric in the center here and fully clump everything around it. That's a little bit silly. Just put Taric front center and surround him with Galio, Lysandra, and Shen. I mean, maybe you could put Soraka here if you're feeling really rambunctious. I also really like Trickster's Glass and copying 2 Shens. One, because now you get double Shen and you get double the shields, double your fun. The second is because then you can get to do the old League of Legends meme, WTF 2 Shens. Make sure you type that in all chat and then deafen afterwards. DFG is Karma's best item. A lot of times people think like Mana Zane would be good, but again, Mana Zane not good in Invokers because you get so much mana already, you don't actually need it. The data also suggests that Karma with Sniper's Focus might even be better than DFG, and especially after the buff, I could see it being better, so give it a try as well. So the legend I would recommend for this would be something like Ornn. Poro, I would say, is the best one generically because you want to hit a lot of these specific augments early. You don't want to have things like Portable Forge and Buried Treasures or anything else that stops you from getting like early education and Winds of Woke, so that way you can get the ball rolling. Zeri is currently the queen of AD 4 cost. There's no other 4 cost that really comes close to her in terms of her versatility and her power. The thing about Zeri that's really strong is that you can play for almost any position. At the very start of the set, people thought that you only play Zeri from kind of a Pilled Over and lose streak, but you can actually play her from a dominant win streak position because of the 3 Freljord shell. So if you're win streaking a lot because you have things like Rageblade and Runin slammed early, you're able to tempo that into a strong level 7 roll down to pick up things like the 3 Freljord as well as the 4 Zon, and then play around all the mods that you get. In terms of the best Zon mods, Zeri's best one currently is Robotic Arm. If you're able to get Robotic Arm on Zeri, it's really good and stacks very well with things like Rageblade. This is because the Robotic Arm that gives you a chance to attack will stack things like that Rageblade a little bit faster, and then Zeri's able to scale really, really quickly. And if you're not able to get things like the Robotic Arm, then the BioWare is also plenty for Zeri to get damage in. As much as this is a Zeri composition, Urgot's even more important a lot of times. This is because Urgot will most likely be the key to your front line. Even though you're rolling for things like Sejuani plus a Bruiser, in this case it's Scion, Urgot items are the second priority in the composition that you're often playing on units like a Warwick, for example, which we'll talk a little bit more as we do the build up. Urgot's best in slot is Bloodthirster Titans, but chances are you're not going to be able to actually get that going. So you're probably going to instead have to play around things like the extra tier and the gloves. So you might end up playing things like a Hodge, for example. This is totally fine. Let's say you don't find Bloodthirster. Instead, you find an extra set of swords and a vest. You can play Edge of Night. I think another item that you can justify on Urgot is Protector's Vow, for example. Kind of similar in terms of making it a tanky unit. But just remember that you're going to be low on damage. So you don't necessarily want to play things like Gunblade, for example. Instead, you can go for a Giant Slayer on Zeri instead. Zeri best in slot is often with Rageblade because of how she scales with the attack speed. She gets so much damage from Gunner that you're able to get a lot of DPS very quickly. A lot of people are starting to build Runins on her so you can have that high attack damage hit another target. Although you can also just put straight up Deathblade if you're playing a 2-gunner version since she's not getting all that free AD. In terms of positioning, you might notice that Urgot's in the top corner in the same side as Zeri. This is pretty intentional. A lot of times when you put Urgot in the top corner, he actually will dash past his target and will start hitting the enemy carry in the back line. And so Urgot's really nice to position in the corners. The only exception is you don't want Urgot to be targeted by things like Lux. Units like Lux will have the DPS to one-shot Urgot before he's able to really get rolling. So make sure to move Urgot back if it's going to be up against like a Lux. But like I said, if you have Edge of Night, feel free to just go ahead and corner him. Keep him on the same side as Zeri. In terms of your other positioning options as well, make sure that Scion is also generically between A3 to A5. You always leave him in the A4 if you don't know where to go, because he's going to charge the farthest unit and most likely hit the enemy carry. Units like Lysandra are used to snipe and stall certain carries. So say, for example, there's like an enemy Jarvan or your opponent's Scion. A stun for a second or two could actually be really, really helpful there. Ashe generically stays here in the center. You can kind of move her a little bit left and right if you want to influence things like Jarvan positioning. So, for example, you don't want Jarvan to jump on the Zeri. You can have Lysandra Ashe move this side, so that way Jarvan hops in the middle here and avoids your Zeri entirely in the bottom right. Sometimes you also can put Ashe in the opposite side of the corner. This is pretty rare, but let's say your opponent has a complete open side here. If they're mirrored, for example, your Ashe has a chance of her arrows just hitting actually the backline carry and slowing their attack speed. In terms of the augments, I want to give a shout out to things like got buffed, like Pumping Up, for example, which is a Mastery augment, which leads into the legends that you could potentially play with it. Mastery with Pumping Up 3 in particular is really strong. Pumping Up 1 and 2 is definitely a lot weaker for obvious reasons. The stats are lower, but also in terms of this relative power level compared to the other tiers. Another augment I think is really worth considering is Dedication. I was originally putting Zoncrest in this slot, but Dedication just got buffed to be the first time you actually field 4 distinct units. They haven't updated on this website, but now it's gone from 5 to 4, and so it's easier to hit 6 Zon once you hit that 4 Zon very quickly. If you do manage to get 6 Zon, you should absolutely play it and pretty much just ditch anything else that is not really important. So in this case, we just keep the 2 Freljord because it links to the Deadeye plus the Freljord buff, but you could really justify a bunch of different things as long as you get 6 Zon in. And this is because the overcharge on all of these mods are so good. Shimmer Inject, for example, instead of healing for 35% when you die, you heal for 100% and your attack speed bonus by 400% increases. That's pretty crazy. Robotic Arm now deals 50% of your attack damage as bonus true damage, which is a really lot. In that case, you probably end up just cutting things like this Gunblade and going for straight up attack damage. The big one that everyone talks about though is Unstable Chemtech, which is the exploding one that kamikazes. So you have Jarvan jump to the back, explode for a bunch of his HP, which is why you want this Warmog, and then you just basically destroy a bunch of their backline. If you don't have Unstable Chemtank, this is going to be a lot less reliable, so you're probably not going to play this variation of it, but if you do end up getting the Unstable Chemtank, you always play Jarvan. In this patch specifically, they actually changed the sequence of which the Zon mods are given to you. The first one will always be some kind of offensive one, whether it's a pure offensive one like Robotic Arm or a hybrid one, as they like to call, like the Adaptive Implant. And then the second one will be a quote defensive one that you'll be able to get, like a Hex Exoskeleton or maybe the Unstable Chemtank. If you don't get the Unstable Chemtank, you probably don't play Jarvan, but just keep in mind that it's not nearly as good. If that's the case, instead you can go ahead and play Scion with, say, like an Exoskeleton. That's actually a really, really strong combination as well. And because you're not necessarily going for like the crazy positioning anymore with everyone surrounding Jarvan so you can jump to the back line, you can go ahead and just position generically again. And so as we return to talk about the normal Zeri composition, you can always just play generic combat augments that get a lot of buffs. So Know Your Enemy is generically really, really strong, as well as things like you have my sword, you have my bow. Special shout out to things like Know Your Enemy, because in this composition, a lot of people are playing things like Bruisers and Freljords currently in the metagame. So an opportunity for you to get some easy bonus damage as well. Buildup is pretty versatile. So I'm going to start off with things that are pretty easy. So you can go like a Jinx and a Tristana start, and then you open up with Warwick. this gives you the first peek into your Zon mod. The nice thing about this current patch is that they actually made these Zon mods detachable. So let's say you get an early BioWare. In the past, if you put on a Jinx, you have to sell that Jinx, find another Jinx, and then replace it in order to move it onto Zeri. But in this case, now you can just put it on Jinx, for example, and then just simply bench her. And when you return, that Zon mod should be on your bench now. From here, you can add just like another good unit. Generally, Warwick wants actually a Juggernaut and not necessarily a Challenger, so you can add in Set. At level 5, you can pretty much just add another Challenger. Let's say you hit an Irelia, for example, that adds to your front line. You actually would prefer 3 front line and 2 back line here in this kind of setup because you just want to give time for Tristana and Jinx to scale. So once you have this level 5, you notice that you're pretty close to Ionia, so you're actually able to add in things like a Jhin, for example. And this actually works both ways, which is, let's say you don't have Tristana Jinx, and you open up more of this kind of opener, then you can also just add in Jinx after the fact. So for example, you can just add in here and now you all of a sudden get the Zon, you get Robotic Arm, you just have a secondary carry Jinx. If you, for some reason, high roll Urgot, and now all of a sudden you have a tie into Deadeye, this is one of the best parts about Ionia is that you have a lot of different adjacent traits to trees like this Deadeye that links to Urgot. So definitely play that early Urgot if you get it. And if you do end up doing that and you hit an early Echo, you can just play Echo and roll for that on 7. And that also goes the other way too. Let's say you're playing this as a core set and then you hit that Urgot, or you hit that Zeri, you finally get that 4 Zon, see your Zon mods and react off of that. A lot of times people make the mistake of like full selling their board for 1-star units. Like they have a set 2, they have an Irelia 2, so they're like, oh my gosh, I hit a 1-star Lysandra and a 1-star Sejuani. And you know what? I even have like an Ashe pair. So let's go ahead and do this. This ends up being weaker than a lot of the 2-star boards that you're able to put together. So just keep in mind that if you end up swapping out your board, you want to make equally strong transitions or better. Because if you replace 2-star Set, 2-star Jhin, 2-star Irelia for 1-star everything else, it's just generally a little bit weaker. From here, you hit, instead of Warwick, you find the Zeri. People end up thinking that you roll for this comp and you play Lysandra at 7 and this is your board. But in reality, a lot of times you're going to have to settle for playing something like a 2-star Brawler instead. This is because you cared a lot more about your front line and making sure that things like Sejuani and Urgot can stay alive, especially if they're not 2-stars. And at level 8, you can go ahead and add the Lysandra again. At level 9, if you want to uncap and you're feeling like 4 Zon and this board isn't really cutting it, you can actually cut things like the Jinx and the Echo and instead play, say, a Senna, so that way you have a legendary gunner that complements the Zeri. And then you can play Scion here as your other legendary top end. And if you're able to get to 9, there's a couple of options that you can choose. A lot of times people go for a Heimerdinger and then you're able to use the triple burn as a way for the Apex turret to get value. A lot of times people actually just go for a triple burn instead of a shrink module in a failure setup because you get the shred and the sunder anyways from their failure trait, and therefore you don't actually need it. But if for whatever reason you're playing Zeri without Failure, try to get that shrink in. Or you can have Last Whisper on Zeri, that's totally fine too. Another legendary that I think is really underrated, especially on this patch, is Rise. They buffed a ton of the Rise variations, so give it a try. And so if I were to go for a big capped out legendary board, it would look something like this, where I go for a triple burn on this Heimerdinger, and you could go for, you know, something like this. The second variation of Zeri that I also want to bring up is the Lose Streak Piltover version, which is still very viable and very, very strong if you get the opener for it. It's still pretty much the same concept as you usually play, just a couple of key differences from the other version that we talked about, which is 1, you're not playing Failure, so you probably want Last Whisper, so you get the armor shred instead of relying on the trait. 2, things like Jace and Zeke's are still really nice to have, but try not to prioritize more than one of them. And then 3, things like positioning can really matter, but at the same time, you generally are kind of bound by having Jace and Zeri right next to each other. In late game scenarios though, the one thing I want to note about positioning is that feel free to not get full value on Jace and Zeke's if you do end up having it, because it's not worth getting Shrouded or J-Ford and just lose all of your units for a couple of seconds, because you rather just have half that value and force your opponents to choose one or the other. In terms of the augments, +1 Piltover is obviously really, really good in the metagame because you're able to get it online very quickly. I would say the latest I would go for Piltover is right after stage 2 Carousel, 2.5, but anything later than 2.5 is probably too greedy. But if you do hit things like Tiny Titans, for example, to give you some life extension, or Transfusion, which is good loose streak, there's other ways you can justify playing a Piltover setup a little bit later. If you're still playing Ornn, you're thinking about Ornn items, you can pretty much use any Ornn item in this composition. The best tends to be things like Death Defiance on Urgot, Eternal Winter on Sejuani, or Anima Visage, although I still prefer Winter if you're able to get defensive items on her. Sniper's Focus on Zeri. Obsidian Cleaver can go on Zeri as well. And if you're streaking with Gold Collector, it could be also a potential item on Zeri too. Gold Crusher is better, so you can also put that on Urgot or on Sejuani, depending on whoever's your better tank. And remember that Urgot is actually really good and versatile with a bunch of these different items because you can use every stat in the game. So if you do end up finding Thieves Gloves, the Capricious Forge augment that gives you 2 random Ornn items, you can put that on Urgot as well. A really crazy combo in particular is Hextech Exoskeleton with Death Defiance. This is a really powerful interaction with the way the damage is dealt over 4 seconds. That's actually considered a debuff that gets cleansed by the Hextech Exoskeleton from what I've come to understand. So make sure to give that a try if you have that set up. Gwen is the queen of flex this patch because there's about like a dozen different Gwen boards. You can play her with challengers, you can play her with Shadow Owls, you can play her with Slayers, you can play her with Reroll, you could just play her by herself. She's also good in build different. So there's different variations, but I'm going to show you my specific variation that I think has the highest cap, which is Shadow Owls and Targon. I think with this specific Shadow Owls Targon variation right now, the most important thing is you play high tempo into finding Gwen and then flexing around things like Shadow Owls and Targon as best as you can. Best in slot Gwen is 1 AP source, 1 healing source, and 1 defensive source. The AP is good for her ability because her Snip Snap is going to do a bunch of damage with the scaled AP. The healing is because she gets within a bunch of range of damage, so she wants to sustain the fight. And something defensive like Titans is also a good defensive item for Gwen as an example because she gets the resistances that scale off of that shield from Shadow Owls plus the Targon bonus. And you get a little bit of offense as well, which is nice. A lot of times Callista's your secondary carry in this composition. You can go for Giant Slayer, Gunblade, and a Guard Breaker, for example. But sometimes you can just play like Rage Blade as well if you're trying to play like a Rage Blade flex opener. But Callista items are pretty secondary, so she pretty much just inherits whatever you can get. I mean, sometimes you can even just put like Shiv, for example, and your board looks something like this. Positioning wise, you want to keep Gwen and Callista on the same side because you want to eliminate carries as fast as you can. If you do manage to find Aatrox, keep Aatrox the same side as Gwen, maybe even isolated from another unit because that way Aatrox will give the buff to Gwen with the Darken. If you do end up finding Taric, remember that you want to always make a Taric sandwich because he buffs adjacent allies. And you always want to keep things like your back separated because you want to make sure to minimize AoE. In terms of augments, a lot of times the way that this is triggered for me is I get something like a Shadow Owl's Crest or like a Targon Heart because it helps me get those bonuses that much quicker. And Buried Treasures is also really strong and a good shout out to Ezreal. You know, we always talk about Ornn augments, but Ezreal augments is his best one is Buried Treasures and the Tiny Grab Bag. So you're able to get extra items for things like the Gwen, the Callista, and your frontline. I want to give a shout out to Stellacorn's Blessing. It's particularly very good in these kinds of setups where every time your units get healed or shielded, aka when your Shadow Isles activates, you get some bonuses. It can be pretty oppressive if you get it rolling. What's really cool about these variations too is that if you do get a Shadow Isle emblem, if you can find a way to get to 6 Shadow Isles, it is very, very good. If you're somehow able to make it to the top end, the absolute best unit to play around with the Shadow Isles emblem, in my opinion, is Cassante. This dude just will kick anything and everything off the board and actually just ends up becoming unstoppable, especially if you give him something like a Protector's Vow. If you do get it with +1 Shadow Isles, I'd probably recommend against the Targon version and just go into the Ionia version instead. So you could play, say, a Shen and a Yasuo as well as Zed. So you get like 3 Slayers in. And then where's that VA go? You're supposed to have him in the whole time. This is actually 10 units. So the Cassante is not supposed to be here. Usually, basically, you have this Yasuo hold items for Cassante. The build-up is pretty straightforward. You start off with like a kind of like as if you're opening up a Tristan or Reroll. You play like Poppy, Maokai, Viego, and then you add in another rogue. A lot of times you play like Zed. At level 5, you could actually just play anything that's generically good. So sometimes you just play like a Soraka and then you find a Taric instead. So that way you get the Targon in. You can also find a way to tag in some backline as well. So let's say you find an early Karma and then you realize that you can tie into the Ionia this way. So if you find a Shen at level 7, this is how your board can start looking. And I think a lot of times people focus on like having like really clean synergies, but if you end up playing like 3 Invokers or 3 Bastions, that's fine for now. Another build up that I actually really like as well is to play around on a Cassiopeia opening with a Noxus because I think that's very strong at the moment. So a lot of times you play things like Cassiopeia, Samira, Swain, and then you add in an invoker like Galio. And then from here, you can add another challenger in. So let's say you play another generic frontline like Warwick, or you can just play the Taric here in this case and find a way to replace Galio with Soraka. And now all of a sudden you're kind of bridging back into that invoker. Let's say you find like a late Maokai. This is how you get the Maokai in, then you hit the Gwen, and then you eventually have this on level 7. If you're in this spot and everything's fully upgraded except for like a Gwen, you can hold on to it for a little bit, but after a while you probably want to replace these units. Cut Cass, Samira, Swain, and just tech in the Ionias from here. Shen, Zed, +1. So let's say it's Yasuo in this instance. And this could be like a level 7 that you play for a little bit while you're able to get your 4 Shadow Wilds online. But if you do have that +1, keep in mind that you ultimately still want to play around that Viego instead. So in this case, you'd be cutting some of these other units and you play a +1 Shadow Wilds. It's completely up to you on how you want to utilize it. As mentioned in other parts of this video, Kaisa is also a really good user of Shadow Wild Emblem, and this is a way that you can kind of bridge that until you find 6 Shadow Wilds. What I really like about this flex setup is that you can totally just pivot into Ionia late game because you just really need to find Shen plus like a Yasuo, and then like no one's really playing Zed. Sure, you can find like one of them. From here, maybe you find a Aatrox and you're able to cap out with 3 Slayer plus a Senna instead. If you find Senna and you just always cut the Viego in this spot, it's not worth the Rogue. Rogue is not that important, and Viego's quite a weak unit late game. Level 9, add in Heimerdinger or that Cassante we talked about, or even that Rise. I think Shadow Isle Rise is a lot better than people give it credit for. And there's all different kinds of variations of Rise that we haven't really tried yet with the Shadow Isle, so have fun with it and see what you can get away with. The best legend that I would recommend for playing this kind of style is actually Earth, because I think Earth with Ancient Archives can give you so much, whether it's +1 Shadow Isles, +1 Targon, +1 Slayer, for example, to give Gwen some more Slayer power. And then Ezreal, of course, to give you more items. If you do end up playing Ornn, you can try a couple of items we've talked about. So like, for example, DFG on Gwen is pretty good. Eternal Winter should go on someone like Shen. Hull Crusher is actually a lot better on Shen right now because of his shielding and his extra damage reduction. Because Gwen prefers to target more multiple units now, you can put a Shred onto her if you want. If you are playing Callista instead, maybe Callista holds on to things like the Sniper's Focus. And if you do get something like Randuin's, I actually think it's quite good in the Targon variation of the Shadow Isles build because you get so much shielding. So the resistances stack on top of the shield. So don't really sleep on this Randuin's in particular. Plus you can clump a little bit like this anyways and you don't really lose much. This is another example that I saw Sologosang's tier list have that I thought was pretty solid. I think 4 Bastion is pretty underrated right now because they got buffed in the previous patch and it's pretty cheap board relatively early because instead of say like Cassante, you're playing like, you know, Cassid and whatnot, and instead of Aatrox, you're just playing another Slayer. So this is definitely another board that you want to consider as well. Let's just take these legendaries out so I can show you what it could be as a cheap version. You could play like this Cassin, for example, and then you add in Zed plus an Ionia that's pretty decent, and you can also play Ahri as well. Well, Ahri's not exactly the cheap, but you could just tech in things like a Yasuo or even a really cheap unit like Jhin for a while before you get there. So yeah, as you can see, there's tons of variations that you can play even within the lines I described. So definitely give it a try, and most importantly, have fun with it. The queen of tempo and challengers is back in the metagame. Kaisa is good again. And the nice thing about Kaisa is that you can pretty much justify any assortment of items on a range of carries because it's really about the sum of its parts when it comes to challengers. You don't really care that much about best in slot. You care a lot about maintaining your win streak and tempo and playing from ahead. And so in this composition, you're focused on slamming items, playing really aggressively, finding ways to get to Kaisa and Yasuo, and eventually Shen if you can. If not, you play Set instead. Also, special shout out to Gwen, who ends up sometimes being another carry that you play around in the midst of this roll down. I gave a Challenger Emblem to Heimerdinger because if you do end up getting a +1, he ends up being one of the best users of it because the attack speed that Heimerdinger gets translates to the Apex turret. But as you're kind of looking at this right now, you have so many options of how you want to itemize. It's actually quite good. So you want to prioritize things like the Kaisa items first, but let's say you get a lot of AD items and bows, you go for Yasuo. If you're getting a lot of extra AP/attack speed, you can itemize a Callista. Let's say you get a bunch of bruiser based items, you can go ahead and put things on Gwen and have her carry as well. Also, really good relationship is if you get long distance pals, you can have Kaisa, Gwen, and feed each other AP, which is really, really powerful. If you do end up getting that, make sure you try to go for, say, an Archangels on Gwen so you can get all those stats feeding to each other with long distance pals. In terms of positioning, a lot of times people put Kaisa towards the center because she will dash to safety. If you have RC on Yasuo, you generally keep him in the first row at A3 and A5 because he'll be able to reach backline carries. If you don't have RC on Yasuo, you generally keep him second row behind behind things like the Shen because you want people to be attacking the Shen, and then Yasuo will not draw any aggression unnecessarily. And even though he has Edge of Night, which is generally his best item, you don't want that to activate too early in the fight. The longer you can go in the fight without Yasuo activating Edge of Night, the better. Kallista's an out that usually you play for if you're stuck rolling at 7 for a very, very long time, and you also have really good items for her. Part of the difficulty of playing around Kallista is that she does tend to have similar-ish items to what Kaisa wants. Both want JG, both want like a damage amp like Giant Slayer and Guard Breaker. A lot of times you end up doing things like Shiv on Kallista as well if you don't have Sparks, so you get that AP shred. The other nice thing about this composition that you can also use Shadow Isle Emblem fairly well. If you do get a Shadow Isle Emblem, I highly recommend putting on Yasuo, Kaisa, or Shen. These are usually the best holders of it because they get a lot of mana and shielding from it, which could be really huge. If you were to play it like this, then you can just probably take in Maokai, for example, until you find Senna. If you're able to find Senna though, Senna is always a play over something like Maokai. Don't cut Kallista, don't cut the Shen. Once you do find Senna though, it becomes really, really strong and obnoxious if you get that +1 Shadow Isle. So play around with it. Maybe instead you have the Shadow Isles on Kaisa and just watch her pop off, or let's say you have a Yasuo too early, you can put it on him. I generally like keeping Gwen and Kallista on the same side, so that way you can kind of blitzkrieg one side of the opponent's board and then maybe find ways to get backline access very quickly. In terms of the augments to choose, social distancing is really good because it gives you a bunch of attack damage and ability power, and that scales well with the attack speed. If you have more attack speed, that amplifies your attack damage and ability power because you're just doing it more frequently. I want to give a special shout out to defensive dash because it gives you a shield, which is good for challengers because challengers don't really have a lot of defensive traits. It tries to focus on offensive items. You generally don't have that many defensiveness. So this gives you the shields to help you stay alive and stay in the fight. Not to mention, it also gives you a Samira, which is really nice for tempo early. One of the best tempo augments that I think people don't talk about is Spoils of War. If you're able to do this and open up with challengers, chances are you're going to snowball the game really heavily and then cruise to an easy top 4 at least. One special augment I want to give a shout out to is Combat Caster. If you're able to somehow get like Senna with Combat Caster into a setup like this, it is Exodia. It's really, really hard to deal with this from the opponent's side, even if they have guard breakers and other ways to deal with shield. This is a very, very difficult build to stop. I want to give a special shout out to sets and the variations that you can play with set. I think a lot of people think that you have to roll for Shen 2 and you'd rather just sell sets 2 for a Shen 1. That's not the case. And this also gives me a good reminder that one of the best emblems for Gwen is Juggernaut emblem, actually, if you're able to get that going. So if you do end up playing a variation that is involved with set, you can just play Gwen, find Aatrox as your top end instead, and that's another way you can cap out your board really high. Build up is pretty straightforward. You just want to go for anything challenger based, and usually you have things like Samira hold your items. So let's say you start off Samira, Irelia, and then you go for Warwick and Kallista. This is a really powerful 4 challenger piece. Let's say you don't have Irelia and Warwick instead, you can go ahead and just play around like generic frontline like Poppy Maokai 2 as well. This is more the mid-roll version, so let's just build off of this instead. In this kind of situation, a lot of times people add like, you know, a Kassadin, or maybe they go for another Shadow Isle unit like a Viego as their 5th unit. For example, play like this. But one thing that I want to give a special shout out to is that you can play 2 Kallistas. Don't forget that her spears end up stacking and then you get that rend execution a little bit earlier. Eventually you find Irelia and Jhin, and then you get the Ionia with the set. Look for that Warwick and you have a really nice core at level 6. At level 7, you are pretty much rolling immediately for Yasuo to replace that Jhin. You can do a 1-star Yasuo over a 2-star Jhin in this instance. And obviously if you find a Kaisa, stick her in as well. There's another opener that you can choose in case you don't have a challenger start and you want to play into challengers anyways. You can open up with things like Void and Sorcerers around Malzahar. Malzahar got some things changed about this patch, so he now targets fewer units, but his AI is smarter, so it ends up being about equal. From here, you can add another Bruiser or another Bastion. We'll just keep it simple and add another Bruiser here, so let's put in this Vi. At level 6, you can either add in another Bastion, so you can get the 2 Bastion, but I personally think this is a little bit weaker. I'd rather try to replace the Vi with 4 Sorcerers. So I play things like this Swain, for example, and a Taric. And while you're doing this, you shouldn't be selling things like your Samira. You can totally hold them. And you can even bridge it as well. So let's say instead of this Taric and this Swain, you find like Warwick and Set. You can also play it like this. Don't feel beholden to just play the standard lines. The thing is, if you sell things like your Samiras and Sets and Irelias, Warwicks, etc., is that you're going to have to roll for all of that on 7, which is a lot harder. So sometimes you bridge the gap by playing something like this, which is actually a reliable board until you can get to that level 7. The other version of Kaisa that a lot of people really like to play is around the Ionia version. Usually you play this if you either hit 1, like a +1 Ionia, or get Ionia specific augments like Sentinel Spirits, or if you get really generic good combat augments and you're able to play for things like Ari because you end up hitting things like blue buff and JG. Ari still is really good, especially if you can get her to 2-star, and the 6 Ionia version of her does a lot of damage still, so definitely play around it if you get the chance to. The concept is still pretty similar though to challengers. High tempo, slam your items, and go for that roll down and stabilize. The only thing is that you're playing for a level 8, and a lot of times in challengers, you probably play for like a level 7 to stabilize first. And the buildup is fairly similar, except you really need to desperately have the Ionia core, so you don't want to be selling things like the Aurelia and Set. The thing I want to point out is that a lot of times people are so quick to not play around Karma, when in reality, Karma can actually deal a ton of damage if you give her items, and she can be the item holder until you hit Ari. I want to give a special shout out to the best Ionia emblem holders. This is a big reason why you want to play vertical Ionia. Ionia emblem is generically the best on Heimerdinger because the attack speed scales the apex turret as well, and in this case you go for kind of the usual stuff, which is like double burn plus a shrink if you don't have any shred, or you can go for triple burn. I could also consider going for something like a Goldenator since they just buffed it to 12%. Other good holders of Ionia emblem are Belveth, but you want to give her more than just the Ionia emblem. So the difficult thing about, say, a Heimerdinger versus Belveth is Heimerdinger can just use the Ionia emblem fine. You don't need to give him any other items. But with Belveth, you want to give her multiple items. So in this case, you go for like a RFC as well as a GS. Aatrox is basically budget Belveth in terms of the item holder of the Ionia emblem, but you want to give him slightly different items. So maybe you give him, say, like Bloodthirster and Titans. And the last shout out that I want to give is Rise, especially if you're playing on an Ionia portal. So let's say you're playing Placidium Library, which gives you the +1 Ionia emblem. I think Ionia Rise with the Ionia emblem is particularly really strong. Okay, this one says Bandle City, so ignore that portion of the text, but the Ionia one now deals damage and legitimately has a shot to carry. If you do end up getting this Rise, try to go for something like Shojin and Rageblade so you can cast a ton, and he might even permanently CC your opponent's board. In terms of the buildup of how you get here, generically for the Ionia, it's the same concept as it always is, which is the 3 Ionia plus Warwick. From here, you add Ashe and complement the Jhin with the Deadeye. You could hit a Lysandra here at 6 and play around Freljord. If not, you can also just play around a Zaun. So let's say you hit an Echo and you get a really good defensive mod like the Kentek Explosion. Don't sleep on things like an exploding Warwick in the early mid game. It just kills some units, even if you're not win streaking. And then at 7, you're rolling for 6 Ionia. So you usually go for Shen. You ditch these Echo. You go for a Yasuo and a Karma. This ends up a lot of times looking like you're level 7. You're not going to always hit things like Kaisa and Yasuo and Shen, so you have to be mindful of that. But if you do hit this Kaisa, you're in a really good spot. And if you do end up hitting the Ionia emblem, a good temporary holder of it is Callista, with the benefit that you could actually chase Callista 3-star as well. If you do end up hitting Ornn items, let's just put Gwen back on the board and cover all of the Ornn items that you can potentially play. Death Defiance is best on Yasuo. Sniper's Focus is actually quite good on Kaisa because she ends up going from the farthest away, so she could end up getting max damage range. Same thing with Callista too. If you end up playing Callista, Sniper's Focus is really good on her. If you do end up getting Obsidian Cleaver, I'd recommend giving it to Yasuo just so it can help chop up the target that he's attacking. If you get Deathfire Grass, DFG, I recommend putting someone like Gwen if you end up playing Gwen in the Challenger variation. I think Gwen probably is the better user of it. Don't put it on Kaisa unless you absolutely have to, because I think it's just weaker on her. DFG generally is better on a single target focus, and Kaisa spreads out her damage a lot. And if you get Zonias, you could put it on Kaisa or maybe Gwen in this spot. So a lot of times the legend that I recommend to play with this is something like Ornn or Ezreal, since you're trying to itemize so many different units. You're trying to go for like a duo or maybe even a trio carry. You want as many items as you possibly can get. So sometimes you just take all the Ornn augments, or you take, multiple Ezreal augments. That's totally fine. Sorcerers are still very good in the metagame. I think a lot of people think the nerf to Ari means that maybe she's a lot worse. That's not true at all. It's still a very good composition and quite possibly OP, especially if you can get to 8 sorcerers somehow through a portal or getting +2 sorcerers. Lux is the queen of single target damage right now. She just bursts like no other carry current in the game. She nukes everything. And so if you're able to get her onto a high prior target, let's say people are leaving their Urgots a little bit exposed or don't have their tank like fully itemized, Lux can one-shot it. Usually the trigger to play sorcerers is having something like a +1 sorcerer, so you can get to 6 sorcerer very quickly on level 6 and be able to also hit everything on level 7 with the Demacia. But as you can tell with the itemization, they all kind of lean towards the same thing, right? Which is like we want to have things like blue buff, Ahri, and Lux. You kind of want to have 2 JGs. You want to have like that bonus damage. You want to have a spark, which means if you get a lot of other components, that is probably going to be hard to pull off sorcerers. So sorcerers is just pretty much a very high roll comp, and try to avoid it unless you have a really good condition. And as we mentioned, the good conditions are things like that itemization on Lux, as well as things like the Sorcerer Heart +1. I personally like Sorcerer Heart better than the Sorcerer Crest, because the Sorcerer Heart lets you hit pretty crazy things like 8 sorcerers without having to go to level 8 if you do end up getting a pretty high roll situation or a pull roll that supports it. I also want to give a special shout out to Parting Gifts. I actually did a YouTube video on an Into Deep with featuring Parting Gifts by Dish Soap, who is able to capitalize off of things like a ZZ Rot that dies and passes that ZZ Rot around. And so if you were to do something like that, you would have it kind of like this, where you have a ZZ Rot on Swain, or maybe a Jarvan. In this case, you would have Jarvan move up forward. You have it die first, and then the ZZ Rot passes from Jarvan to Swain to Taric, potentially the Malzahar. In this instance, you wouldn't have to prioritize Spark here. Playing around early game sorcerers is purely around Malzahar as well as the Void. So if you do end up starting with this, you're in a really good spot. Then you can add this Swain in at level 4. You have 2 sorcerer. From here, you add a little bit of backline, maybe add this Orianna. And if you find Taric, I believe it's worth dropping things like this Void if you can get that 4 sorcerer with Taric specifically, because this means your frontline is pretty good. But you can tech in the Void back in anyways if you find Vel'Koz. And let's say you go back and you do have that sorcerer +1, then you end up getting 6 sorcerer on level 6. And this is a really strong way to play your mid game, because you only need to find like 1 Taric and 1 Vel'Koz. Rolling on 6 in this comp is very good before you roll at 7. When you get to 7, you're looking for the Lux, but the thing about Lux is you really want to activate the Demacia. That's why you put 2 items on her specifically, so that you can get the Demacian items going, which means that you generally want to find the Sona for the multicaster and the J4, but you're not really going to be playing this unless you're able to hit a +1, because you notice that with Sorcerer Heart, you can't really squeeze this all in unless you have a +1. So this is the most important thing to consider when you're playing 6 Sorcs, is usually having that +1 is really important. The alternative is, let's say you don't have this Sorcerer Heart, but you're playing on a really high economy portal, or you just have a really big gold opener and you're streaking, you can go to level 8 and roll for everything on level 8, and then just have basically this level 8 board, but maybe instead of, say, Malzahar, you're playing a Ahri instead. And there you have it. The board is pretty much set in stone from there. Ahri is your win condition. Lux isn't enough to usually win. I do want to give a special shout out to double Luxes though. Let's say you're in a spot where you do have a +1 sorcerer, then you have an opportunity to play 2 Luxes, and I think 2 Luxes is actually quite underrated. Just give her the other like random items that you have, something like this, and then you can have both these Luxes cast, and they'll together nuke a bunch of stuff. It's not that common of a scenario, but you know, if you do have more Luxes and you just can't find Ahri and like nothing's working out, just play 2 Luxes. It's fine. Legend I would recommend for this is probably Veigar, because you can get things like Jewel Lotus, which is really powerful, or you can just go for something like Poros to get maximum chances at some of these specific augments. Ornn items are not easy to play in this composition. I would say that DFG Lux is the best, and then Eternal Winter best on like a frontliner. You could probably put on Swain. After that, it's a little bit slim pickings. Mana Zane can be pretty good on Vel'Koz and Sona, but you have to kind of build around them, and that's a little bit harder to execute currently in metagame. You could probably get away with Trickster's Glass on a frontliner, maybe Trickster's Glass Jarvan, so you get 2 Jarvans, or even going back to that Lux idea, you can go double Lux, but I don't know. Then you're not really having like a radiant item, or you have to sacrifice another item for it. So there you have it. All of my favorite queens in the current meta game. They're all so strong, so fun, so powerful, so independent. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.